From Microbe TV, this is TWiP, This Week in Parasitism, episode 176, recorded on October 8th, 2019. Racaniello, and joining me today here in New York City, Dickson, Despommier.
Good afternoon, Vincent.
And remotely, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon, Vincent. Good afternoon, Daniel.
You doing okay there, Dickson?
I'm okay.
Okay.
If you like what we do on these podcasts, please consider supporting us financially. Microbe.tv/contribute. All right, Daniel. Now, it's been a month. You gave everyone a month.
Yes.
And now we got a bunch of guesses. And so remind us what our last case was.
Oh, certainly. Our case last time was a 70-year-old man that I had seen. He was born in India, came to the U.S. back in 1985. He's gone back and forth to India, but he hadn't gone back for about 2 to 3 years. And he is admitted with the acute onset of a fever, a cough, and just not feeling well. He says he was fine till about a week prior to this. And then he lost consciousness. Actually, that's what prompted him in. He ended up on the floor, brought in by his son. And he had a fever of 102 when they bring him in. Initially, they did some cultures, urine, blood. These came back negative. He does have a history of kidney stones, type 2 diabetes, elevated cholesterol, no surgeries, no family medical issues. And initially, before I was asked to see the gentleman, he was started on 2 antibiotics, vancomycin and Zosyn, which is a brand name for a piperacillin tazobactam. Broad spectrum.
Sorry, what was that?
Piperacillin tazobactam.
Good Lord. If you had to order that as a stat, I think you'd get tongue-tied.
I think that's why the brand name has done so well.
Zosyn is much easier.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think I mentioned he'd been on the antibiotics for a little bit, and I was told, Dr. Griffin, this is a quick one. We don't think this guy has anything going on, but if you could just take a look at him before we stop those antibiotics because everything's coming back negative. Get a little more history here. This gentleman works in a post office. He lives in a house on Long Island, private home. He doesn't report any toxic habits. But then we get a little bit back farther. He said that he had been hiking a few weeks back in Rhode Island, and he tells us no pets, no other animals. The initial exam was unimpressive, but then we got some blood work. His hematocrit was 25. I'll say normal would be about 40 for this gentleman. Hemoglobin 9, so normally about 13, 14. His platelets are quite low at 39. Normally would be 150 to 400. His bilirubin is elevated at 5.3. His transaminases or liver enzymes are slightly elevated. He has a clear chest scan. And there's a blood smear done. On the blood smear, it shows anisocytosis. So there's some not equalness of the size of the red blood cells. There's microcytosis, so some small red blood cells. Polychromatia, this is sort of a non-uniform color to the red blood cells. He has 4.3% reticulocytes. And where I left it was putting this all together, I ordered one test. And 90 minutes later, I get the call and we start treatment. And I think we have the little comment there that this gentleman was known to be HIV negative. The HIV test was negative.
Dickson, can you get that first one?
Sure. I don't know. It's so long. Alan writes, diagnosis, Babesiosis, in parens, speciation to be determined, i.e. it's either B. microti or B. duncani.
Alan's an MD.
Indeed he is.
Want to take the next one since that was so short?
Sure. Andrew writes, Kia ora kotu from Pongarora, New Zealand.
So that's the pronunciation. Why don't you do that? That's better.
No, I'll just skip to the to the letter.
Kia ora koutou Pongaroa.
Right. That's
Kowtow.
That's the name of that town.
New Zealand.
I don't know whether that's the South or North Island. I'll have to look it up. I'm a longtime listener of TWiP and the rest of the TWiXverse. However, this is my first contact. I am a computer programmer by profession. I was going to say by confession, but have always been turned on by sciences and vociferously devour podcasts.
Voraciously.
Well, okay, voraciously. I have to get back in the groove here. Podcasts, audiobooks, and videos on many subjects, including Vincent's virology lectures and Dickson and Daniel's video series. Great. Winter is turning into spring here, and the temperature is 11 C and cloudy. My medically untrained diagnosis is babesiosis. My first web searches turned up lots of possibilities, including malaria, but an article on dog parasites caught my eye, and I fell down a rabbit hole, or a mouse hole, would be more accurate, a white-footed mouse hole. So that was a good reference. So I listed some facts about the disease and checked them off against the information provided by Daniel. Symptoms: fever, tick. Hemolytic anemia, tick. Loss of appetite, tick. Dry cough, tick. Liver affected, tick. Vector transmission. No, I didn't put that down. We did, actually. Geography. Vector, a black-legged tick, is endemic to Rhode Island, of course, into the entire Northeast, by the way. Other, can be identified under a microscope due to characteristic Maltese cross formations, so the 90-minute time frame works. Also, Dickson mentioned a microscope. Did I? I'm not sure I did. Usually a self-limiting disease. It can be more severe, even deadly, in an immunocompromised. A 70-year-old with diabetes might well have trouble clearing the infection. The disease is common if underreported in the Northeast United States, so Daniel would not be overthinking things if this were the case. I will wait with anticipation to see if I'm right. If not, I have enjoyed learning about Babesia Starkovivi and how one can not love an organism that is also called Nutalia because of the, chocolate and hazelnut spread that represents. Namihi, which I guess means see ya. Andrew.
Nice.
Yeah.
Daniel, can you take the next one?
Certainly. Cameron writes, hello, TWiP experts. First time writer here. It is a cool 78 degrees near Kansas City, Missouri. It is quite literally the calm before the storm as we brace for incoming weather. I'm going to go with my gut instinct here and guess the patient has presented with babesiosis. Babesia microti is an intracellular parasite, being an apicomplexan. It is of the same family as Plasmodium, which would explain these similar symptoms. Babesiosis often spread by ticks of the Ixodes family, or possibly even our new friend, the longhorned tick. Mm-hmm. This would explain the elevated bilirubin, burst cells, assuming I heard that correctly, and elevated reticulocytes, as Babesia has a tendency to lyse its generous hosts. The patient's age and location are both risk factors for infection. I suppose you could have run an ELISA test to determine the infection. However, you could just as easily run an eyeball test and look for 2 ring tropes within the red blood cells of the patient, or the 4-pointed merozoite. Treat with chloroquine and azithromycin or clindamycin and quinine if he's really sick. Even if I'm wrong, I enjoy an opportunity to talk about this fascinating organism. It is a current favorite of mine due to the vast similarities to malaria. I had a fun time presenting a paper on the disease and its effects to a poor, unprepared English major for proofreading before handing it in for my parasitology class. As an aside, I'm currently wrapping up my last year as an undergrad and am getting ready to enter into a medical lab sciences program in the next year, and hope to find myself working even closer to infectious diseases in the future. I love all of the ASM shows, although I find myself partial to this show and TWiP, and Immune is becoming a quick favorite as well. Thanks, Cameron. And then P.S., if you have any extra books laying around, I believe my school's biology department could use a good home.
That's a real possibility.
I like when they say first-time writer, because then it's clear they haven't won a book before.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Makes it easy, right?
That's right.
So the next one is from Cecilia. Dear Doctors, the case study you presented reminded me of the case from episode 156 from August 2018. Your patient had become infected with Babesia on a camping trip. Since the patient in the current case study had been hiking in Rhode Island, I thought he might have unknowingly been bitten by Ixodes scapularis and become infected. I did a Google search of the incidence of Babesia in Rhode Island, and according to their state health department, there were 161 cases in 2017, with the majority occurring between June and August. Since the gentleman's hiking trip was in June, this would also point to babesiosis. Since Babesia causes red blood cell destruction, the patient's anemia could be caused by Babesia. The elevated liver enzymes and 102F fever are also symptoms according to PD7. The most likely species causing the patient's illness would probably be Babesia microti. Since there are over 100 species of Babesia, it could be another as well. Babesiosis is classified by the CDC as an emerging infection due to its increased incidence. The patient could also have co-infection with Lyme disease or Ehrlichia, since they share a common vector. Since this is a parasitology podcast, Babesia is the most likely cause. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge through the podcast, as well as the fantastic resources made available to your listeners. I hope I got the right answer to the case study. Sincerely, Cecilia in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Nice.
Dickson.
Courtney writes, Dear Doctors, hello from Omaha, Nebraska. It is currently 32 degrees Celsius and the sun is shining. I am submitting my guess for episode 175, Babesiosis. Babesiosis was my originally starting point. Hiking in the woods, ticks disease. At first, I wasn't completely sold on babesiosis, as the description in parasitic diseases didn't include anything about losing consciousness, and our patient didn't immediately scream, immunocompromised, at least to us non-medical folks. Turning to the tables in PD where it lists signs and symptoms and the associated diseases, nice catch, I began comparing between fever and chills and malaise. I read through several other diseases, T. cruzi, toxoplasmosis, lymphatic filariasis, and balantidiasis. Nothing really fit. Either the location was wrong or the patient was missing a few symptoms. So I Googled parasitic diseases, losing consciousness, malaise, and fever, and lo and behold, babesiosis. Even though it turned up a second time, I still wasn't completely sold on it, so I read the CDC's information about it. And he gives a website there. Alas, there it says the elderly are susceptible to it. This still doesn't solve my issue of him losing consciousness until I noticed anemia and blood pressure mentioned. Low blood pressure, unstable blood pressure can cause loss of consciousness. At this point, I decided to listen to the part in the podcast where y'all talk about the new case, and anemia popped up along with low platelet counts and other signs of babesiosis. Therefore, babesiosis. Thanks for the amazing work. Yeah.
It's interesting that when they describe their process, right? It's good not to always trust Google.
That is true.
Or anyone, for sure. You should always have two confirmations, right?
Trust Google, don't trust Googlers.
And now Daniel hits the jackpot.
Oh, my gosh.
So, Kevin, am I reading Kevin's?
You are.
Okay, this
we'll
could
be
be a
out
while.
of the room for a while. We'll be back.
You're gonna mute your and go off, and so TWiP 175 is reminiscent of TWiP 156, a case presented almost exactly 1 year ago. In that case, a Nepalese woman tangled with the exotic diseases of Long Island. Now we see a 70-year-old East Indian man with fevers and various hematologic abnormalities. He has the suspicious history of bushwhacking in Rhode Island. This puts me in mind of a now archaic joke in Chicago that went, "Where are you going on vacation?" "The islands." "Oh, Hawaii?" "No, Stony Island, Blue Island, Rock Island." Interpretation: 3 very unglamorous Chicago area locations. I suppose that our TWiP 175 patient might reply, Long Island, Coney Island, Rhode Island.
Could be Block Island.
True. The solution of TWiP depends on some refreshingly low-tech aspects. In our world of cell sorters, nucleic acid manipulations, and the whole schmear of automated methods, it is nice to hear terminology that describes humble blood smear findings. The entire concept of smear transcends the idea of low-tech and even sounds a bit degraded, almost disgusting. I recall the term fecal smear being regularly used in parasitology, though it does not appear in PD7. It still makes an appearance in PubMed as a mesh heading search term. Unstained red cells were described by Swammerdam, Malpighi, and Leeuwenhoek in the mid-1600s, but it was not until 1877 that Paul Ehrlich used stains to differentiate blood cells. Polychromatia is a pretty but misleading word that describes the delicate grayish-blue coloration of Romanowski or May-Grunwald-Giemsa stained RBCs, in distinction to their normal pinkish coloration. The word polychromasia misleads because the cells so described are more monochromatic than polychromatic. Our patient's polychromasia most likely reflects the high percentage of reticulocytes identified in the automated cell count. The anisocytosis refers to RBCs displaying a variation in size, which probably reflects the immature cells, which are larger than mature RBCs entering the circulation. Our patient's elevated bilirubin, anemia, mildly elevated liver enzymes all point to a hemolytic anemia. When energetic, I try to construct a differential diagnosis of at least 3 alternatives. This arbitrary construct may owe something to numerology, remnants of Trinitarian theology, and just plain cussedness. Anyway, it signifies an attempt to forestall premature closure. Despite this good intention, I will discuss only 2 alternative diagnoses. Diagnosis 1. Our patient has been to India within the past 1 to 3 years. It is possible that this fever, low platelets, and hemolytic anemia is relapsed malaria due to Plasmodium vivax, which is widespread in India. PD7 states that latent malaria, hypnozoites in the liver, which emerge and cause acute malaria infection, can relapse up to 5 years after the initial infection, and the Australian Public Health Network cites a figure of 8 to 9 years. Dr. Griffin mentioned that the diagnosis was available within 90 minutes. Such a quick turnaround time is possible using either a rapid diagnostic test, RDT, which detects malaria antigens, or an examination of thick and thin blood smears or films by an experienced technologist, physician, etc. Diagnosis 2. Our patient's rural idyll, his hike in Rhode Island 4 to 8 weeks ago, may have resulted in an Ixodes scapularis bite with transmission of Babesia microti organisms. The CDC states that the incubation period of babesiosis is 1 to 4 weeks. In 2017, there were 161 reported cases of babesiosis in Rhode Island, with most cases composed of males in the 70 to 79-year-old age group. Compare this with 138 babesia cases in 2017, Suffolk County, Long Island. The 90-minute turnaround time could be achieved by the inspection of at least 300 high-power fields using 100x oil immersion light microscopy. Serologic or nucleic acid-based testing would take longer. CDC recommended treatment, atovaquone plus azithromycin. The combination of clindamycin and quinine is also an option. I will submit that our peripatetic patient has contracted babesiosis in the pedestrian flesh pots of Rhode Island. He is admonished to practice safe walking in the future, using insect repellents and providently tucking his trousers into his stockings. Thanks for a great show.
Safe walking, huh?
Safe. I like that. Safe walking.
Right. There's a lot that follows, but I think
many references on malaria. We have
we do.
Babesia references.
We do.
Blood smear references.
We do.
As well.
But Daniel, just as an interruption here, didn't there already exist a blood smear?
Of what?
Because that's how they did their differential count for the diagnosis.
That is okay. To go with that thought, man.
Could you have used that smear to then re-examine?
because you're thinking this might be babesiosis, and you're thinking the blood smear is going to give you the answer.
Or either that or malaria, one of those two possibilities, as Kevin raises. But you already had the blood smear, so you didn't have to make it again. Is that true?
So that is actually, that's if you're concerned about babesiosis. And a few years ago, I saw a patient. And that patient turned out to have babesiosis. And all I did was I went to the blood lab and I said, hey, we did a CBC, complete blood count, with a peripheral smear. You mind if I take a look at that CBC?
Good on you.
And I just looked at it, and we saw 10% parasitemia with babesia, and actually some of these really nice Maltese cross forms. And so, yeah, the thing... The comment you make is interesting. We often think of it as requiring a separate test. Oh. The only reason it's often separate is a separate technologist who's trained in how to look at these needs to be involved. Yeah. But you can look at a CBC with differential. You can look at that smear and diagnose something like babesia if that's what you're concerned about.
Yep.
Malaria, the issue, and this is also with babesia true based upon percent parasitemia, a thick smear is going to be more sensitive.
Right.
But the thin smear is going to give you, species, the opportunity to identify species.
Yeah.
We have a little section at the end called some terminology.
Yeah, I saw
it's
that.
smear and schmear. Different things.
Two totally different things.
Now, he gives a reference to a book.
Right.
Now, schmear this. On language, the Jewish Daily Forward by Philologos, and he gives a link to that.
Do you know what a schmear is?
Yeah, it's what you put on a bagel.
Exactly. It's cream cheese. Cream cheese. It's a bagel and a schmear.
So there's a little article here in the Jewish Daily Forward. You can read that up. And then TWiP is schooling me in the 3 Res: recrudescence, relapse, and recurrence.
Excellent.
1. Recrudescence is the term for recurrence of infection with all malaria species, including P. falciparum, P. malariae, and P. knowlesi, which lack hypnozoites.
Right.
This occurs when the infection, unless a new infection has persisted in the blood at undetectable levels and then becomes detectable again. P. malariae can persist as a low-level, normally asymptomatic erythrocytic infection in humans for up to 40 or 50 years.
Exactly.
Whoa.
Exactly.
The Popovici reference defines recrudescence as real treatment failure. Number 2, relapse, reactivation of dormant parasites from the liver. 3, reinfection, a new infection due to a new infectious mosquito bite. The 3 REs. Wonderful.
How about that?
Joel writes, hello. Hi.
Hey, Joel.
I haven't made a guess on a diagnosis since TWiP 99. Wow. So I thought I'd give it another go. I'm not very well versed with parasites other than what I've learned on the podcast. So it took me a while to get to a point where I'm confident enough to try to make a guess. I love the challenge that you pose with each of these, and I had fun digging through the internet to put the clues together. Initially, I thought the signs of anemia sounded like malaria, but you mentioned that he hadn't left the country in a couple of years, so I figured that wasn't it. However, and this is my interjection, recrudescence.
Or relapses.
I then chased a few ideas that eventually led to dead ends with various worms and flukes, but finally I came across something I was not aware of that causes hemolytic anemia as well as some flu-like symptoms, is endemic to the northeastern U.S., and the key for me was that it is spread by tick bites. This clicked for me since your patient had been hiking in Rhode Island shortly before having symptoms. So my diagnosis is that he was infected by Babesia microti. From my research, it seems that the primary method of diagnosis is by simply viewing the parasites in the blood cells from the blood schmear. So I'm not completely sure what additional test would be ordered to confirm. I see that PCR is used, but as was discussed, that would be difficult to get done in 90 minutes. Perhaps an antibody detection assay that would be able to get a quick confirmation. That's my best guess anyway. As for treatment, I found 2 main options. First, combination of atovaquone and azithromycin, and the other is a combination of clindamycin and quinine, both given for a week or 2. Thank you so much for doing this podcast. I really enjoy learning about a subject that doesn't get the attention it probably deserves. And even if I'm wrong, it is still a fun exercise, and I always learn something new, which is more important anyway. I'll try not to wait so long this time before sending in another diagnosis. Have a great day.
That's a good letter.
Thank you, Joel. Dickson.
Jim writes, Dear TWiPpers of the Bite parasitic. My guess is the 70-year-old gentleman was bitten by an infected tick while hiking in Rhode Island and has come down with a serious case of babesiosis. Thanks to a quick diagnosis and intervention by Dr. Griffin, followed by a course of selected antibiotics, he should recover well, provided he still has his spleen. Let us all hope for a speedy recovery in any event. And the reference was that if he didn't have a spleen, people have died from this infection, no matter how much antibiotics they received, because they're still an essential ingredient in the immune system dependent upon spleens sequestering infected cells and killing the organisms. I listen to TWiP frequently, but this is my first time guessing. Great podcast as always. Take care, Jim in Vancouver. Yeah.
Daniel.
All right, Peter writes, but this time we don't have a pronunciation guide, so Sharave TWiP. Just a quick guess, as I have recently started a new lecturing position in the Institute of Technology Trolley. So I'm busy preparing lectures and brushing up on my veterinary anatomy.
Cool.
Although I miss my colleagues in Trinity College, Dublin, I'm delighted to have gotten a position not so far away and to keep collaborating with them.
Nice.
Also, looking forward to studying parasitology in the waters and wilds of Kerry in South Ireland. I was also able to keep my practical parasitology teaching position with the Royal College of Surgeons Ireland, RCSI. And as a result, that I am now sending this email from RCSI Bahrain.
Ah.
That's pretty cool. Have you guys been to that part of the world?
I have. I've been to Qatar, not too far away from Bahrain. I've also been to Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So that's on that coastline.
Okay. I was lucky enough to have breakfast with Professor Samuel McConkey, head of the Department of International Health and Tropical Medicine at the RCSI this morning. And like any self-respecting parasitologist, we soon got to talking about animals trying to eat us from the inside. I brought up this month's case study, and Professor McConkey suggested I consider babesiosis.
Nice.
Looking into Rhode Island prevalence, I see a seroprevalence of 20 to 25%. So although I do not have time to read deeper, I'm happy to put my money on that. Professor McConkey also spoke of the importance of a differential in successfully treating a patient and what else you might consider for this patient. Based on that discussion, I would include strongyloides and P. vivax. Mm-hmm. I've already won a book. If not sent already, I would be grateful if the delivery address be changed to that below. Slán, Peter Stewart.
Great.
Okay.
All right, Peter's got a book, so I'll take off the number from him. That's number 8, right? Yes, so we'll put number 8 on the next one, which is Dana writes, hello, TWiP professors. We believe the most likely diagnosis to be babesiosis because of the patient's history of a hiking trip 1 to 2 months prior, high fever, hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, and elevated liver enzymes. A treatment option would be atovaquone with clindamycin. Sincerely, the Western U Global Health Track students, Stephen, Alex, Vicky, Irene, Chris, and Dana.
Cool. That's cool. That's very cool.
Very cool.
A
Dickson.
group answer. Peter writes, good day, dear doctors of TWiP. Judging from the website, I might be just in time with this guess. Unfortunately, exciting developments in the world of genomics epidemiology has kept me away from parasitic diseases 7th edition, and thus a chance to hazard a guess for most of this month. Hopefully this email manages to sneak in before episode 176 is released. The 70-year-old presenting with fever and cough might be suffering from babesiosis caused by the tick-borne parasite of the genus Babesia. In the northeast USA, the pathogen of interest is often B. microti, spread by the deer tick Ixodes scapularis. This disease is associated with anisocytosis, increased reticulocyte percentage, a symptom of hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, low platelet count, and elevated bilirubin. It is known to be more severe in the elderly due to their weakened immune symptoms. Cough is not a common symptom, but can be present in some cases. The history of hiking could suggest exposure to the ticks that carry this parasite, but time to onset is typically weeks, not months. The 90-minute test that Dr. Griffin reports could be an antibody test. These are available for detecting B. microti. Treatment for severe illness is, according to PD7, intravenous clindamycin combined with oral quinine or IV quinidine. Another possibility is malaria, specifically that caused by Plasmodium vivax. He has a background in India, one of the parts of the world where P. vivax is prevalent. A recent map in gathering et al. 2012, presumably P. vivax was more prevalent in India than in the past, and P. vivax malaria can recur many years after initial infection. The elevated bilirubin also suggests malaria, but increased percentages of reticulocytes suggest to me that this is not malaria, since P. vivax destroys these young red blood cells. However, seeing it all report a case of Plasmodium vivax infection with autoimmune hemolytic anemia that had elevated reticulocyte count, saying it all 2012. Again, the 90-minute test could have been an antibody test. Rapid to diagnose, I'll read this again. Could have been an antibody-based rapid diagnostic test, of which there are several for malaria. I tend to think the babesiosis diagnosis is more likely than malaria, though. And then he gives several references, and that's Peter from Cape Town.
Cape Town. You been to Cape Town, Dickson?
I have. It's a lovely place.
Daniel, have you been to Cape Town?
I have not spent time in Cape Town.
No,
it's gorgeous.
If
you look forward to going, you'll have a great time.
All right, this is from Caitlin. I can't remember if Caitlin won a book or if I sent it, so we'll leave her out. Dear Parasitriarchs.
Good read.
Forgive me, fathers, for I have sinned. It has been 5 months since I last wrote into TWiP, and since then I confess that I have been cheating on you with other podcasts. But is it really infidelity if they're also on microbe TV?
She must be Catholic.
I guess, yeah, she knows this stuff. Yeah, sure. I remember all that from my youth.
We're about to break out in a cold sweat here.
But, it's not cheating if it's microbe TV.
No, it's not.
When I first listened to this case, my mind immediately went to relapsing malaria. Although he had not visited India for 2 or 3 years, that is well within the window of time for hypnozoites to wake up.
True.
However, I would also expect for there to be relapses every few months if that were the case. Furthermore, PD6 tells me that Plasmodium vivax typically infects a relatively low proportion of erythrocytes and usually has only 1 or so per cell. Thus, I looked further.
Mm-hmm.
The extensive
try that
fakery that showed, I don't know what that is, F asterisk ampersand KERY. Is that like the curse word?
I have no idea.
It showed up in the blood smear, made me think of the spleen, and the hiking trip in Rhode Island made me think of ticks. I would hazard that this gentleman has babesiosis. He fits the typical profile given of a high fever, loss of appetite, generally feeling like crap, and given that he is more or less immunocompetent, improvement within a reasonable amount of time. I note that infection of the erythrocytes can reach a whopping 80%, which is frankly quite rude, even by the standards of parasites. It's also fairly easy to diagnose with PCR by looking for the Maltese cross on a thin blood smear. I'm hoping for PCR since even I know how to do that. Treatment is either a combination of atovaquone and azithromycin or clindamycin and quinine, which has the advantage of also working if my initial guess was correct after all. So, without access to Daniel's test, I'll cover my butt and pick that one for my imaginary patient. Caitlin in Seattle, where it's supposedly 14 degrees Celsius, but I don't believe them.
It's colder. It probably seems colder.
Do you think it's colder, Dickson?
Probably seems colder.
Can you take the next one?
Philip writes, Dear esteemed TWiP team, you had an interesting case study for TWiP 175. I'm going to guess that Dr. Griffin ordered a parasite blood smear and the patient was found to have babesiosis. I don't think this was a malaria relapse case only because I have friends who were born in India and endured malaria, and they seemed keenly aware where they had it again. Also, the fever history described for the patient did not seem to fit malaria. The 1 to 2 month interval between the patient's tick exposure in Rhode Island and the onset of symptoms is very interesting. Back in the late 1990s, I worked with the New York State Department of Health and reviewed dozens of babesiosis cases on Long Island. It was difficult to judge when onset of symptoms occurred following a tick bite, since so many of the cases were continually exposed to deer ticks. The literature generally considers babesiosis onset to occur 1 to 3 weeks after a tick bite, and a number of cases I reviewed had tick bites in that time frame. However, epidemiologically, we found babesiosis onsets peaked from mid-July through mid-August, lagging a good month behind the deer tick nymph season and Lyme disease rash diagnosis peak. We suspected median incubation could be longer than typically stated. In a 2011 Annals of Internal Medicine review of transfusion-associated babesiosis cases, where the Babesia exposure timing is pinpointed, found the median interval from transfusion to symptoms onset was 37 days. Perhaps tick-transmitted Babesia infection falls along those lines too. In any case, Dr. Griffin's patients demonstrated how more distinct exposures needed to be considered. I would also recommend Dr. Griffin and other clinicians consider babesiosis for any febrile patient with deer tick exposure in a babesiosis transmission area who also has hemolytic anemia, low platelets, and high monocytes. I worked at a hospital on eastern Long Island that used those 3 hematologic criteria to trigger a reflex parasite smear. We found dozens of babesiosis cases that way. The reflex lightly sped up administration of appropriate therapy and curbed unnecessary antibiotic administration. Just something to consider. I enjoy the TWiP podcasts immensely, and I am astounded you all find the time to do them. So am I, actually. Be great, Philip from Long Island.
You're astounded, Dickson?
I'm astounded, and I'm also pleased that we're still doing them.
Well, we've gone to a once a month now. So.
We have. Well, we could revert backwards if we wanted to.
Daniel.
Kim writes, Dear TWiPpers, I have only recently been introduced to your dynamic and totally absorbing podcasts. I am a travel health nurse living in Torquay, England, mother of 5 now grown-up children with a fascination for all things parasitic. I have a degree in medical microbiology and recently completed a diploma in tropical nursing at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine.
Outstanding.
I am new to parasitology, but will make an educated guess at this week's remote location, gentlemen. To be honest, I have found this one a bit tricky, so possibly not a good case to start with, but here it goes. Looks like this chap has contracted the disease Babesiosis. My reasoning is as follows. Babesiosis is a disease caused by the invasion of the red blood cells by the protozoa of the genus Babesia, resulting in a febrile hemolytic anemia. In America, most human cases of babesiosis are due to Babesia microti. These parasites are spread by the tick Ixodes scapularis, the black-legged ticks or deer ticks. It seemed to me that this gentleman has picked up a tick bite when trekking previously. Malaria is unlikely as he hasn't returned to India for 2 to 3 years. Blood film indicates a hemolytic anemia with other examinations unremarkable. Most cases of babesiosis are contracted in the United States and Europe. Hemolytic manifestations of the disease are commonly named pancytopenia, splenic rupture, DIC, or even HLH. In this case, the gentleman has evidence of hemolytic anemia in the blood film with acute onset fever. Typically, liver enzymes are only mildly raised. Tick-borne transmission is typically in certain regions of the U.S., namely the Northeast and upper Midwest. Hence, Rhode Island, where this gentleman has previously been hiking, is endemic for these insects. Daniel asked for one test, which was conclusive for his diagnosis of this condition. I believe he asked for a blood film to be done specifically looking for the intracellular parasites in the red blood cells. Typically seen on the film within the red blood cells is a structure called a Maltese cross, 4 myrizoites budding asexually but remaining attached. Treatment is atovaquone plus azithromycin or clindamycin plus quinine. And we get some doses there. Sorry if this is wrong, but I've really enjoyed researching it. Can't wait to hear your next podcast. Best wishes from Torquay, Devon, England.
Roger that.
David writes, Dear esteemed professors, I have been an avid follower of the TWiP podcast for a couple of years now, and I want to thank you for such an entertaining and educational show. I love the rapport between the 3 of you, and in particular, I love the cases that Daniel brings to test our knowledge. I worked for the Public Health Laboratory Service in the UK for 22 years, and a large part of that time was spent working in the enteric diseases laboratory. As part of the daily routine in our enteric lab, we would pore over stool samples looking for intestinal parasites.
No pun intended, of course.
Our lab is in the beautiful northwest of England, quite close to the Lake District. We are well served with clean water and functional sewage services, so we found mainly Giardia and Cryptosporidium, and very little more exotic than that. We were always excited to receive external quality control samples for fecal parasitology and competed to find a wider range of more unusual parasites. I had a second career in biotech, working for a succession of incrementally larger U.S. biotech companies in business management. But now I have started my third career and taken a wonderful job at my alma mater, the University of Central Lancashire, teaching our undergrads the wonders of medical microbiology. Stimulated by your wonderful podcasts, I have started a parasitology club, and we will tackle the fascinating challenges set by Daniel as a group activity. This is my first crack at winning a signed copy of your wonderful book, or at least chipping my opinion into the case for TWiP 175. The hematological profile suggests hemolytic anemia supported by the raised reticulocyte count, red cell hypochromia, and microcytosis. I believe the low hemoglobin levels and general anemia may have induced the collapse. The patient being of South Asian origin, having been a relatively frequent visitor to the region, I immediately concluded this was obviously a kind of malaria, which may have reactivated due to failing immunocompetence due to age. I found in PD7 that malaria species other than P. falciparum may produce hypnozoites, which can lie dormant in the liver for up to 5 years, so I clung to the malaria diagnosis for a little longer. Many of the clinical signs, high fever, thrombocytopenia, anemia, and altered liver function, could fit with this diagnosis. Somehow I was uneasy about the conclusion and distracted by Daniel's comments that he was not overthinking the diagnosis and that a single test was all that was needed to confirm the diagnosis in about 90 minutes. I hunted PD7 for more options and came across the section on babesiosis. This was a parasite that I had not encountered in my lab days, as it is normally the domain of a hematologist rather than a pooologist. A biblical light shone on the page and a choir harmonized in the background. The clinical signs for the case were consistent with babesiosis, and data from CDC confirmed that the geographical distribution was consistent with the gentleman living in the northeast of North America. His recent hiking trip to Rhode Island could have exposed him to being bitten by the black deer trick, Ixodes scapularis, that can transmit Babesia microti. Data from CDC shows that Rhode Island has the highest incidence of babesiosis in North America, with 16.3 cases per 100,000 population, and the gentleman was living in New York, which is in the top 5 with 2.4 cases per 100,000. Mm-hmm. So I am saying a prayer and making the sign of a Maltese cross and putting my hard-earned British pound on babesiosis as the diagnosis for this pyrexial and anemic Indian gentleman. The single lab test that Daniel will have ordered would have been a Gimsa or Wright stain on a thick and thin peripheral blood film. The hematologist would have been looking for characteristic ring forms in single pair or the characteristic tetrad Maltese cross formation. Treatment as recommended by CDC, atovaquone with either azithromycin or clindamycin and quinine. The first meeting of our parasitology club will consider this case and the new challenge coming in TWiP 176. Thank you again for your fantastic podcast. David from the University of Central Lancashire. That's a very nicely written one. Actually, they all are. All their unique styles.
That's right.
And humor.
Indeed.
People definitely take time.
They do.
A lot of effort.
That's because we take time. I think that's a return of favor, basically.
Well, I tell you, they're being read, and billions of people are listening.
Billions.
Billions.
So you want to do your best, right?
Billions.
Right, so we have one more, Dickson.
Lizette writes, Dear TWiP professors, greetings from sunny Florida. I am hoping this email still makes it on time for this month's case study. I really want that signed copy of your parasitic disease book. Last time I did not win, so I am going to keep trying. That's the spirit. I could just buy it, but this way is so much more entertaining, and, I might add, reasonable. I am going to keep it short, so here's my guess for this case. Babesiosis. The main clues that got me to this parasite were 1, hiking trip in North America not long ago, 2, main symptom was fever and anemia, and 3, patient had relatively good health, but included a high-risk group due to diabetes and age. Also the fact that Daniel said to keep it simple. Since the last paper was on malaria, which when I listened to the presentation of this case study, my mind went straight to Babesia. By the location, it is most probably B. microti. I remember my professor stressed a lot of differences and similarities between these two protozoans. My last guess is that the quick test was an antibody test to find specifically B. microti. Am I close? Thank you so much for your amazing podcast and keep up the good work. Best regards, Lizette from the University of Michigan, class of 2019, Bachelor of Science in Microbiology. Perhaps you should go over and see Kathy Spindler and pay her regards.
Lisette must know Kathy Spindler.
She's got to. Everybody knows Kathy.
Well, that was a lovely collection.
It certainly was.
And it reinforces our decision to do this once a month because we get more guesses rather than twice a month, right?
Well, that might work.
Of course, the downside is I don't get to see either of you, but
well, I will come in anyway.
There are always
I know you
trade-offs.
get lonely in here.
Dickson, there are always trade-offs.
This is true.
By the way, let's find out from Daniel how these people did, and then I want to tell you an anecdote from my recent trip.
Excellent.
Actually, Dickson, what did you think it was?
Well, until I read all these reviews, of course, I was leaning towards malaria because the gentleman was from India and there is a relapse history of malaria vivax. And it wouldn't be out of the question to see that he might have had both of these parasites. But then the hiking trip and the simple test, well, the simple test was just a blood smear, so that doesn't rule out the fact that it could have been P5X. But I think I'm overwhelmingly convinced that it's babesiosis.
Dickson, if someone hadn't been in India for 2 or 3 years, can that stay latent for that long? I guess is the word.
If you say he hasn't been back to India in more than 5 years, the odds are that that's not malaria at this point. But with 2 or 3 years is not a long time. Basically, hypnozoites can reemerge from the liver up to 6 or 7 years, basically. So you have that window. It's a kind of a fuzzy window because it varies from place to place.
How frequent is the reactivation?
Well, that's interesting.
Depends, right?
Yeah, a friend of mine, Bob Gwads, was actually one of the researchers who helped to establish the hypnozoite to begin with. Mm-hmm. And the answer is that it's not known.
Okay.
It's just not known. It doesn't occur on a regular basis, though. It appears to be random, but there must be some kind of a biological clock inside each one of these things that just causes it.
Could be external stimuli, too.
It could be.
Daniel, can you shed any light on this?
You know, I was looking through my list to see if I've ever done like a really long, between when a person was somewhere and when they had their malaria. So I'll have to check and see if I've done that. But I've seen as much as 3 years, and then the person coming in with a relapse. So we'll have to see if that's something we've ever considered. Vincent, did we get your guess before I?
So I thought the hiking was a big clue there, and this fever and anemia really did it. Didn't sound like malaria to me. Yeah. So I thought when he said it a month ago, I thought Babesia. Yeah.
Okay.
So there was one thing that I sort of hats off to one of the emailers that were in. So when we did and it was a blood smear, had him look at the blood smear, and you could see it was actually 6.6% parasitemia with Babesia.
No.
So
as Caitlin would say, that's outrageous.
and you know right away. How do you know right away that this is Babesia and not a relapse of malaria? And Dickson, should I put you on this, or should I comment about why the 6.6 tells me that?
Well, I wouldn't be able to respond to 6.6, but I could respond to the shape of the infected red cells and whether or not they had Schuffner's dots and whether they were enlarged or not. And so if I didn't see any of those characteristics, it wouldn't have mattered what the percentage was. It would have mattered what they looked like. So I'm more of a visual guy.
Okay. So the percent is interesting. If we think about the different, we'll say the 5 human malarias, there's only 2 of them that have a relapse from a hypnozoite. So these are going to be the Vivax and the Ovale, and the Ovale now has subgroups, but they tend to parasitize only about 1%.
Yes.
Where it's our Knowlesi, our falciparum or falciparum that are going to, 5, 10, 6.6 could definitely be for those.
True. That's true.
So when you see above a 1 or 2%, and the person has been outside a malaria endemic region for years, even before they start really looking closely, even if they're not sure what the blood parasite is, 6.6%, 10%, you'll often see that in Babesia. And the patients actually look quite a bit better than if you have a 6.6% parasitemia and a Plasmodium
That's right.
infection.
Right. Okay.
The other thing I want to say about one of our emailers, and I gave a nice broad, the person had been hiking 4 to 8 weeks before. Now, I saw this case in August, and the person had been in Rhode Island in June. And the reason I gave that wide time span was that we know this is Babesia, and we really know when the exposure seemed to be, but it's outside what's normally described. You look at the CDC, you look at a lot of resources, and they say 1 to 4 weeks. I don't think that's accurate, and I think this is an example of that, where it was closer to 8 weeks prior to him coming in and seeing me, and clearly having confirmed babesial infection, when he probably got the tick bite in the exposure.
Yeah, and by the way, you should probably mention also that the seasonality of this infection is changing because of the climate change issues that we've got. And the guy by the name of Rick Ostfeld, who's in charge of the Institute for Ecosystem Studies up at Millbrook, studies ticks as a indicator species for the change of weather patterns and change of climate patterns. And he sees changes also in the distribution of Lyme disease patterns. The seasonality has been extended. Is what I'm saying. And you get more mast years for oak trees, which produce the acorns, which makes the ground squirrels happier and increases their host range as well. So a whole bunch of stuff is going on out there that will alter these, what you would call normal patterns of disease outbreak, which I guess was why the CDC considers this an emerging infectious pattern, because obviously we're getting a lot of changes out there.
That acorn thing, right? I mean, I don't know if people have noticed, but here in the Northeast, there's a tremendous amount of acorns. I don't know if you have noticed. I have noticed, because I see this and I think, oh, next summer is going to be so exciting.
It's 2 years.
Because we're going to start to see this this burgeoning of the rodent population, followed by an increase in the tick-borne and other diseases. So I'm very excited.
Hantavirus.
Yes.
So how did the gentleman do after treatment?
So the gentleman was treated with azithromycin and atovaquone. And, he started to get better, but I should point out, and I think one of our emailers actually asked this, whenever I see a patient that has a tick-borne infection, I also check for co-infection.
Right.
And there's actually some pretty good data showing that a reasonable percent of the time, a person will actually have co-infection. This person turned out to also be co-infected with Lyme disease.
Wow.
And so we actually treated them with doxycycline as well.
Goodness.
And no, they did very well. So
Borrelia burgdorferi.
There you go.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry.
Willie Bergdorfer.
That's right.
So
it's amazing that ticks don't die with all those infections. It really is.
Caitlin would have said rude, not whatever it was. That amount of parasitemia is just rude.
Yes.
All right. So ticks.
Ticks.
So I was in Galveston last week. I visited the University of Texas Medical Branch, which was the first medical school in Texas. And they also have the Galveston National Laboratory, which contains high containment laboratories up to BSL-4. And they have 2 interesting facilities there. They have an insectary where they breed mosquitoes.
Right.
And they brought us in to show us. It's a fabulous room. Everything is sealed. There are screens on the doors, and the mosquitoes are kept in plexiglass cages, and they have species from all over the world.
Right.
And they're in there, and they use them for experiments. They actually bring them into the BSL-4 and infect them with arboviruses that are transmitted in mosquitoes, and they can put them on animals. They had a species, I can't remember the name, but it had little feathers on its legs, what looked like little feathers.
Huh. A mosquito?
That was a mosquito. Mosquito. Wow. With feathers. Let me see if it was on the legs. They weren't really feathers.
No, they're setae or scales. They could have been scales.
They were so beautiful.
Wow.
It began with an H.
Hemogagus?
Yeah, it was a hemogagus. Yeah.
That's that's the species of mosquito that transmits yellow fever to monkeys in the canopy trees.
Okay, the sylvatic cycle.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
was beautiful. They had they had 80s Egypti, they had 80s albopictus, they had all kinds of, just beautiful, just beautiful. And you know what? They have to account for every mosquito.
Absolutely.
If one gets out, they have to find it. and he told me one once got out once, and they spent 15 hours looking for it, and they had to do shifts. And he goes, you know where it was? Behind the CO2 tank.
They are attracted to CO2. There's no question about it.
Oh, actually, that is great. I like
That's funny. That's very
he
funny.
thought that was funny. All right, but more relevant to this, they also have a tickery.
Tickery.
It's the only tickery associated with a BSL-4 laboratory.
Wow.
And they breed ticks, and so ticks will not take artificial blood meals like mosquitoes do.
Right.
You have to feed them on animals, so they feed them on rabbits. They have ticks mainly from Turkey. Hymiloma?
Amblyoma.
No, not amblyoma.
No.
I got them wrong. I should look it up. But anyway.
I should know this.
So the tickery is also, it's all white, so you can see the ticks if they get out, and you have to wear white Tyvek, and you have to account for every one. You have to count them all. So what they typically do is they get eggs, and they bring them in, and the eggs hatch, and they breed them. And he showed me a vial with a female laying eggs. And
Is Bob Tesh showing you all that?
no, it was my host, Dennis Benty, who does the tickery.
Right.
This female was laying 15,000 eggs.
They're prolific.
And they have to separate all these eggs out. They hatch them and so forth. And then they will bring them into the BSL-4. They can feed them on an animal that's been infected with a virus. The one he's interested in is Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus, which is transmitted by these ticks from Turkey.
Hyaloma, isn't that the...
Might be hyaloma.
Hyaloma,
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah. Oh,
very
absolutely.
tedious
You bet.
work,
You bet.
and really hard, expensive.
I know that
hard,
very well because they were pushed out of Rockefeller
They
to
went
Yale.
to Yale, right? Yeah.
in the old days to make room for, whatever they thought was more modern biology, right? Except they found a home no matter where they went. And when they went from Yale down to Galveston, that's when Robert Shope Jr. went with them.
And Bob Tesh and Bob Shope, right, went
That's
to
right.
Galveston. They took the virus collection with
They
them.
did. And they also started a black fly colony.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know if that was still maintained down there. Did they have any Rodnius prolixus?
What is that?
The one that the reduvid bug.
No, not that I know of.
Reduvids.
But it was really interesting. And in
It's
particular,
another science. It's a whole other world, isn't it?
it's just people slaving away to do this
right.
stuff. And
That's
it's just tough. And
Exactly.
it's really, most people don't recognize this. That's why. So I'm a
do.
good person to visit because we can talk about it on our podcast. We did 2 podcasts there, and they're going to come out in coming months. But to see the ticks was really something. And they're doing cool. Oh, one more thing. So they found in Turkey there are some ticks that bite tortoises.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, in graveyards, where people bury their dead, the tortoises get stuck within them because they go in and they can't find their way out, but they stay in there and there's plenty of food for them to eat. And these ticks bite them. And then when people go in to visit their loved ones, they get bitten. So he had a tortoise there, and they're doing experiments with ticks to see transmission on the tortoise. So really cool stuff. And, he said he went to visit, and he learned about this over there because you don't read this in textbooks.
No.
No. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm very privileged to be able to travel and learn these things. People want to tell us about what's going on. I appreciate it.
And see it firsthand.
And we will disseminate it.
We will.
So ticks are never going to go away.
Nope.
There are a ton of them out there.
Yep.
By the way, he showed us a movie, and this will come out on the video. Most ticks sit on blades of grass and they quest, and you bump into them and they hook on. The one tick he showed us chases people. He showed a video. It's a big tick. It's about 1/4 inch, and it runs after people. You have to go away. If you just stand there in the field, it will run and crawl up your leg and bite you. It's really an attack tick. Okay, enough. Sorry, folks. going to repeat it all on TWiP. So, all right, we have a paper today, and I just want to warn everyone that Dickson doesn't like it.
Well, I wasn't attracted to it. Let's put this way.
I want to hear this, Dickson.
Why I was not attracted to it?
Why you were not attracted?
Well,
let's hear.
Well, there were two things. One is that this is an in vitro study, and two, it makes a big stretch between the co-dependency of interfering with T cell function on two, what I would consider, I forget the name of the biochemical term for this, but you've got a collection of proteins in SEA, which is a soluble egg antigen. Okay. It's not a single thing. It's a whole bunch of things. Mm-hmm. So you still don't know what's doing it. And the other thing is that you had to co-expose the cells to the omega-1 fat derived from plants. Now, how unlikely is that to come together in a patient with HIV-1?
Well, omega-1 is in the SEA.
I know. Well,
no.
They had to use that as a recombinant from a plant-derived material.
So why don't we go through the paper and then hit the issues that
those were my objections.
Arise.
I didn't have any other objections. I think the findings that they showed were very good, and there is a lot of overlap between schistosome infection in Africa and HIV-1. Right. So that's a good thing to keep track of.
So this is a PLOS Pathogens paper. It's called Schistosome mansoni soluble egg antigen, which is SEA,
right, and
recombinant omega-1 modulate induced CD4 positive T lymphocyte responses and HIV-1 infection in vitro by Muser, Polakis, Smits, Thomas, Yazdanbaksh, De Jong, and Paxton. These are from Amsterdam University Medical Center, University of Liverpool, and Leiden University. As Dickson said, parasites like schistosomes modulate immune responses.
They do.
And they can modulate CD4 positive lymphocytes, which are the target of HIV-1.
They skew it towards the Th2 responses.
And in many parts of the world, as you said, co-infection is likely, right? Between schistosome mansoni and HIV-1.
Yep.
So this paper is looking at this. Now, in the paper, they look at two kinds of infection. You can add virus to cells, which is, they call it cis infection, I think. And then the virus can be picked up by other cells and transferred to the CD4 positive lymphocytes. So there's a molecule on dendritic cells called DC sign that is thought to attach to the virus, bring it, and the DCs, of course, go into lymph nodes as part of their displaying antigen to lymphocytes, and they inadvertently bring the virus with them, and then that will infect lymphocytes, the Trojan horse.
Is that on a tether-like molecule, by the way?
Yeah, it's called ICAM3 grabbing non-integrin, DC sign, dendritic cell specific, and it just tethers the virus. So the virus doesn't infect the dendritic cells, so that's trans-infection. And in fact, that's what's going to be inhibited by these soluble egg.
Your organic chemist must be going crazy. Now, you can't do that to cis and trans. Don't you remember?
Of course. But those words are used for many other things. And so, as you said, helminths skew immune responses towards Th2 responses.
Mostly antibody-based responses.
Antibody-based responses. And there's a Th1 responses. There are Th17 or suppressor responses.
Right.
And so the question is, what's the effect on HIV? Now, if you look epidemiologically, the findings are conflicting. In some cases, it looks like co-infection helps, it's beneficial, and in some cases, it's not. So they're thinking here, let's look in vitro to try and sort this out, because the epi studies are complicated in people because too many things are probably going on to be able to sort it out. And so they look at SEA, soluble egg antigen, which is an extract from eggs.
The word I was searching for was gamish.
Gamish. It's an extract. It contains hundreds of proteins.
Hundreds of proteins.
Many of which are glycosylated and many of which bind DC sign. So they're thinking, maybe these could have an effect. By the way, these things make a lot of eggs every day, right?
Well, that varies with the species.
So they're in the liver, right? The pair?
No, they're in the mesenteric vein.
Mesenteric vein, and the eggs get put in the gut lumen, and then they're shed.
Well, half of them. The other half go back to the liver.
And this is a pair, right?
Yes.
They find each other
They do.
delightful.
They do.
Right?
And they stay married for life.
Right.
It's like swans.
And they're cranking out eggs. Right?
They are cranking out eggs. That's their job.
All right. To spread to other hosts.
That's right. And by the way, the female can't produce eggs unless she's paired with a male. Mm-hmm. So the male transfers something into the female, which allows her to do that.
Okay. So omega-1, which is a main component of SCA, has been found to drive Th2 responses.
That's where that comes from.
This is an RNase, which enters cells and degrades cellular RNAs. That is amazing, right? And that's important for Th2 skewing. This bloody protein, well, it's not bloody. It gets into cells and it degrades RNA as a way of skewing the cells towards Th2. That's amazing.
That's pretty amazing.
How dare they?
So they wanted to see what the effect of this component was on HIV infection. And the first thing they do is show SCA itself can inhibit trans but not cis infection. Trans is infection via binding DC sign. And so one of the components of SCA binds DC sign. So it's probably competing with that sort of. It doesn't inhibit cis infection, no. Which is just adding virus to CD4 positive lymphocytes, right? But trans infection. All right. That's the first thing. They have a reasonable effect. And so SCA has a lot of molecules in it, right? As we said, hundreds. So which ones are responsible for that? It turns out by depleting, it looks like kappa 5 is a main component. What is kappa 5 here? Kappa 5. Well, we have omega 1, which is different. The main components of SCA are alpha 1, kappa 5, and omega 1. And kappa 5 seems to be the major inhibitor for this trans infection. So kappa 5 is binding DC sign, and that inhibits infection.
You're winning me over, by the way. I'm changing my mind about this paper.
I'm glad.
Okay. Now they do a series of experiments where they're looking at mixed cultures which have been induced to Th1 or Th2 or mixed Th1 plus Th2. And these are matured in the presence or absence of SCA or some of these other products. All right. And then they infect them and they see what happens. The Th2 cells have a lower are less well infected when exposed to dendritic cells as compared to the Th1 cells. When you mature the CD4 positive cells to Th2 in the presence of SCA, you get reduced infection. So what's causing that? It's not a matter of altered chemokines or cytokines. It's not a matter of reducing the receptor for the virus. So it's something else, probably intrinsic to the cell, that the virus requires to infect it. Now, the next series of experiments is this recombinant omega 1.
Right.
And what are you talking about? The plant omega?
Exactly right. This is why I'm changing my mind.
So this is a protein. This is a protein. Remember, which is an RNase.
I may have read through this paper a little fast,
and it may have been produced in plants, but they just made a recombinant form so they can get enough of the protein to put it on. And remember, omega 1 is a main component of SCA, and it skews lymphocytes to Th2 by getting into the lymphocytes and degrading mRNAs and so forth. So the presence of omega 2, you get less infection of T cells, Th1-2 mixtures, okay, after exposure to DC. So this is the trans infection. So the omega 1 appears to be inhibitory. It's the main component responsible for reduced infection of Th2 cells. Let's Let's simplify it. Okay? And trans, not cis, trans only.
Does that make sense based on the other findings?
Yeah, I mean, it's a component of SEA that seems to be, there are lots of other components. These are the three major ones in terms of quantity. So omega-1 seems to be able to do this. It inhibits trans infection. Now, the question is, of course, what is the relevance in vivo in a person?
Right.
So I guess you would have to somehow manipulate this particular component of SEA to figure out what was going on, because SEA has so many components that I don't know if you could figure out in people what was going on and what maybe you could do a clinical trial and give people omega-1. But we do have effective antivirals, so I don't know why you'd want to do that anyway, right? Talk about the introduction of HIV into the colon, right, which depletes the gut-associated lymphoid tissues within the first few weeks of infection. But it also causes bacteria to translocate into the mucosa, and that causes severe problems as well. And so they're thinking if there is omega-1 in there as a consequence of eggs from the worms that are being shed, that this could have an effect on this bacterial translocation. That's something that they want to look at. So this omega-1 is reducing infection. How it's doing that isn't clear. They have a whole bunch of hypotheses for what might be going on in these lymphocytes, but they say we need to do more work to really understand exactly how this is being inhibited.
So if you had a Th2 specific cell type, and there are those, and you expose them to omega-1, are they less able to then generate antibodies?
I don't know. They didn't look at that. All we know is that they can't be sufficiently infected and trans by HIV-1, which means being given the virus via DCs.
So they don't behave like a Th2 cell at that point. They behave like a Th1 cell.
Well, no. You're reducing the ability to infect these cells, right?
Right.
But they're still Th2 cells.
Agreed. So what is the what I'm driving at is, what is the biology of this virus infection with regards to susceptibility of cell type?
Well, the Th2 seems to be the main CD4 that's susceptible, right? Daniel, is that correct?
Yes. So just to break down your Th2 a little bit. So your Th2 response, the antibodies are being made by the B cells in response to Th2 skewed T cells, CD4 cells that are susceptible to the HIV infection. And so what they're showing here, you've got the two different types of HIV, the R5 and the X4. And so the R5, CCR5 tropism, those are the ones that usually start infection. And then later on, they shift to a X4 tropism. And so, sort of interesting things they're saying here, to give it a broader context, is people had this idea, we really got to get rid of schistosomiasis from these areas because it's going to increase people's chance of getting HIV. And boy, if you have HIV and schistosomiasis, you're going to get sicker. But then when they've done these control programs, you get one answer in Uganda, you get another answer in a different country. The only one where we had compelling evidence that this was a protective was in the genitourinary, so the female genital schistosomiasis studies. So what is interesting here is they're saying it seems like maybe part of our confusion here is there may be something of a protective effect to mucosal exposure to HIV if you have schistosomiasis infection, but we don't really want to give everyone schistosomiasis infection. So maybe if we can understand what is promoting that, maybe one of these SEA components, then maybe we can create a little bit of a better protected Th2 mucosal environment when people are exposed to HIV.
So it's a good point that they use the R5 HIV, which binds CCR5 co-receptor. Not X4 doesn't seem to be affected by this, as Daniel said. And there are two components, right? There's the omega-1 and the kappa-5. These both seem to inhibit R5 trans infection. And whether this happens in people isn't clear. As Daniel said, you have different transmission patterns in different countries, and men to women, women to men, men to men. They're probably all different. Exactly. So they say we need to do more studies. They say, these antigens possess the capacity to influence infection. Whether this happens in people, we don't know. And they also say that, a lot of vaccine trials are being done where S. mansoni infections are endemic. And so it's possible that the schistosome could impact the vaccine take, right?
That's an interesting issue, because one of the things they're suggesting is that SEA may have the ability to down-modulate some of the inflammatory signaling, like the LPS-induced signaling, the toll-like receptor 4 signaling. So if schistosomiasis is modulating the immune system, and we're going to go in there and try a vaccine, maybe like, vaccine worked here, but it didn't work here. You may need to know the schistosomiasis endemicity and the impact that has on the immune response you're trying to drive with your vaccine.
I think that would be information you'd want to collect. If you're giving people an HIV vaccine, you should know if they're schistosome positive or not, because then you sort the data based on that and see if it makes any sense.
Yeah.
So it's an effort, Dickson, to back off and look at the molecules involved, and then do we see an effect? And we appear to. So now we can go back in people and make more sense of it.
I'm a little bit discouraged, and that's on a general term, by the fact that SEA is still being worked on without knowing all of the components and without bringing it down.
Well,
when I was a graduate student, I knew about SEA, and they were talking about SEA for, the eggs of this parasite get into the tissues, and then they elicit granuloma formation. And the granuloma formation depends on the length of time that you've been exposed to the eggs. If you look at the beginning, you get these huge granulomas. If you look 10 years down the road with the same person, you get tiny little granulomas. So they came up with this hypothesis that there's some inhibitory substance that's being produced by the immune system to lower the circumference of the granuloma, which spares the liver, by the way, because a lot of this granuloma occurs in the liver. And as a result, it's bad news for the liver cells. So that's all.
Even though it's SEA, they did break it down into 3 components.
Yeah, no, they did.
And 2 of the 3 seem to be active.
That's right. The omega-1 is the big star here. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that is important to say. They're not just saying, we've got this SEA crude extract, we're just squirting it in there like we did 50 years ago. They, over time they've identified, kappa-5 is actually a lectin binding, and we think that's interesting. Omega-1, we know a bit about that. So they're doing, kappa-5, and they're doing kappa-5 depleted SEA, basically pulling it out or not and seeing if it is the active component. So even though they talk about SEA, they're breaking it down and using components of SEA in a lot of this work.
Yeah, that's right.
Dickson, do you have a hero?
I do.
Who is it?
I actually do. This is a person that I personally I was more than passingly acquainted with this gentleman and his activities, because he at one point was the dean of the veterinary school in University of Pennsylvania. And I used to be invited down there to give talks at the New Bolton Center, which was a fabulous place for veterinary research. And this man, his name is Lawson Solsby, who later on moved back to England, of his country of origin, to become I believe, now I'm just saying this, of course, because I'm going to read his obituary. Unfortunately, he's passed away recently. Became prominent at the Cambridge University School of Veterinary Sciences. And he's a champion of trying to bring together medical sciences, veterinary sciences. So when he was at the University of Pennsylvania, he always incorporated his presentations and his invitations to include all of the parasitology groups at the medical school as well as at the vet school. He was of a mind that there's almost no difference between some of these parasitic infections in humans as compared to, let's say, primates, or let's say even cattle. He was a big fan of cross information to alleviate any disparities that might exist between veterinary scientists and physicians. So let me just read this, because this is copied out of a memorial service that they had for him by the Royal Society of Veterinary Sciences. So it says, Lord Solsby, distinguished vet and one health pioneer, died this week at the age of 90. After weeks of deteriorating health, he passed away on Monday morning with his daughter by his side. Lawson Solsby began his veterinary career in private practice before moving into academia. After obtaining a PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 1952, he went on to take up lectureships at Bristol and Cambridge universities before becoming professor of parasitology and chairman of the Department of Pathobiology at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine in 1964, and that's when I began to know him. In 1979, he became professor of animal pathology at the University of Cambridge. By the time of his retirement, he had become dean of the School of Veterinary Medicine. He was the only individual to have served as president of both the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and the Royal Society of Medicine. In 1990, he was invited to become the first veterinary surgeon to be elevated to the peerage in the House of Lords as Byron Solsby of Swaffham Prior. In 1996, he was elected an honorary fellow of the RSM, one of the distinguishing groups of fellows, which had a maximum of 100 members at any one time. Babul Sethia, the current RSM president, said the society was saddened to hear of Lord Solsby's death. He was the first veterinarian to be elected our president and continued to engage in the work of the Royal Society for Microbiology, mostly recently through the endowment of traveling research fellowships. I think RSM is medicine rather than microbiology. I misspoke. Lord Solsby was instrumental in forging new connections between medicine and the veterinary profession. So I had the pleasure of knowing him and having dinner with him and sharing, alcoholic beverages of various sorts at various times at meetings. His humor was palpable. His sardonic take on life in general was treasurable. You could quote him at various meetings and various statements about politics and the way money is mishandled and the way information is misused. He was a champion of simple logic and simple approaches that connected together to make things into a complex relationship between, let's say, the sciences of immunology and epidemiology, for instance. He was a broadly based individual with Catholic tastes that extended beyond his sciences. He was a man of letters. He was extremely well read. I liken him to the Churchill of infectious diseases societies because of his broadly based knowledge and also his wit and humor. It was a wonderful combination of personality traits that led everybody to really adopt him as one of their own. And I was privileged to know him, and I'm happy to be able to share this experience with the listeners for this. The other person that was a little bit like that too in her own way was Bridget Ogilvy, which we've already talked about. And she and Lawson became lifelong friends, of course, after he moved back to England, and shared many of the jobs of who's going to get how much money and for what. And they were very instrumental in making sure that the parasitic disease community, both at the veterinary and medicine levels, received their fair share of funding from the Wellcome Trust. And for me, he's one of the big heroes of all time. He's great.
He was the Queen's veterinary surgeon.
How about that?
I guess she has lots of horses and dogs who need attention.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dickson.
You're welcome.
I forgot to pick a winner.
Oh, we didn't forget. We just delayed it.
Well, we had 13 entries.
We did.
So let's pick a random number between 1 and 13. Are you ready?
You want a drum roll?
Number 10. That would be Philip. Philip from Long Island.
Nice. Yeah, you could hand deliver that. We'll give it to Daniel. We'll give it to Daniel on
Hey, Philip, give me an email, TWiP@microbe.tv, and get me your address, and we will ship you. Now, we have to wait for you gentlemen to sign another batch of PD7. So
We do.
You know, we're having our Parasites Without Borders meeting this Thursday, Dickson. So
That's
if
true.
you can have a bunch of books in hand, I can.
Bunch. That's a little tall order there, my young man, because I'm a lot older than you and they're heavy.
Oh, I may have-
No, you'll have to come here and sign them, I'm afraid.
someday,
I'm not going to lug them all the way down there.
sometime Daniel will be here. Okay.
Of course.
Well, you could bring. Could you
Well, we
bring
have a-
4? It's too much, huh? 2.
I could bring 2.
All right, bring 2, and Daniel and you sign them. And
Well, we could get Charles Knersh to sign them also because he'll be there as well.
well, if you want, it's up to you.
He's
I don't
another
care.
author on the book, sure.
Yeah, I understand.
Sure.
All right, Daniel. What's next? What new case study?
Oh, a new
yes.
case. Is everybody ready?
You-
I like this one. I think that this, apparently this last one was much too easy because everyone got it right. So we'll see how this goes, and if this is too easy, then I'm going to have to make them harder again. But let's see how everyone works this one out. This is a recent case, and this is a woman in her late 20s. It's a school teacher. And she wakes up in the morning on the weekend. It's a Saturday, and she is completely, as she said, she's rashy. She has a rash from head to toe, and she feels that she must be having an allergic reaction to something. So she goes, it's the weekend, so she goes to an urgent care center, and they say, yes, you must be having an allergic reaction to something. And they give her antihistamines and steroids, a steroid pack.
Oof.
And they recommend that she go see an allergist. Okay. A few days go by, and she's still got this pretty significant rash. She's still itchy. And she goes ahead and decides, I'm going to see that allergist. So she sees her allergist. And the allergist does a whole bunch. You know what they do? Where they poke you with a ton of needles,
Mm-hmm.
and they say, we did everything, and the only thing that's coming back here is, you seem to have an allergy to dust mites. We don't think that that's what's going on, but everything else is negative here. A few more days go by, and now she goes and sees her general practitioner, and I'm still itchy. I still got this incredible rash all over my body. I'm taking the prednisone like he told me to. I'm taking the antihistamines. And the physician does, I will say, a more thorough exam and notices that she has these small red lesions on her fingers and between the fingers. And the doctor then does a little bit more investigating. There are some phone calls. It turns out that there are several children in the classes that she's been teaching who have a similar malady. She is given some sort of a therapeutic, and the rash goes away.
Okay.
A therapeutic to be named later.
Yes.
Now, does she touch these kids during the day? I guess so. Right?
I feel like this is enough. But no, I'll give
This is plenty.
only appropriately there, Vincent. No, so she is otherwise healthy, active, doesn't have any toxic habits, as you like to.
HIV negative, right?
HIV negative. No prior medical, no prior surgical. She doesn't take any medications on a regular basis.
Is she married?
She is not married, but she is in a long-term relationship.
And her partner does not have this affliction?
No, her partner is actually not physically around at the time that this develops. He is out of the country.
All right. There you have it.
What do you think, Dickson? Do you think this is enough?
It's plenty.
It's almost too much.
Quite interesting.
You're on the edge of actually telling them what it is.
Okay. And I will, just to give people a little context, this is occurring in, we'll say, the outer boroughs of New York City, if that's of any help to people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he doesn't mean the little donkeys of New York City. He means the boroughs of New York City.
One of the outer boroughs of New York City.
Right.
That came up once before, outer boroughs, right?
It did.
Let me read one email, and then we will wrap up this episode. This is from Christine, And Christine just won a book last time. That's why I'm reading this. Good afternoon, gents. I have my notifications set to alert me when new episodes are released. The second I saw that the September episode for TWiP was released, I dropped everything so I could tune in. I honestly had no expectations of winning. I was excited to see if I was right in my diagnosis. Honestly, I've never won anything in my 4 years. And wow, what a fantastic feeling.
Can't say that again.
Especially when it is something you really want. The timing also couldn't be better. The day before, my boyfriend, our friend, and I were approved for a business loan and began renovations on our soon-to-be pub. The next day, I quit my job and am currently working my last shift and a half. I know, Vincent, you aren't an author, but the book is coming from your podcast, and I wouldn't be the proud owner if it wasn't for you starting the series of podcasts. Thank you for all the wonderful information you guys share. I hope to be able to get a diagnosis in for this month, but I've been so busy, I don't know if I will be able to. And you did not, but that's fine. Don't. Well, of course, you might submit it in the day or so it takes me to post this, but that's it. We'll just stop there because the next one is long, and we'll save that for next time. Long and interesting, so we shall read it next time. And that's it for TWiP 176. You can find it on any podcast player. Please subscribe so you get every episode. If you haven't tried to guess on a case, maybe today is the time to do it.
Exactly.
And if you submit a guess of any sort, you enter in the drawing for Parasitic Diseases, edition 7. Right?
Right.
If you really like what we do, you could consider supporting us financially. You could go to microbe.tv/contribute. We have Patreon or PayPal ways that you can give us as little as $1 a month. And if you're interested in supporting Parasites Without Borders, which is the other organization of which we are a part, you can go over to parasiteswithoutborders.com, and they have ways of donating as well.
Indeed.
All worthy causes. We are attempting to educate the world, in particular on TWiP, about a subject which is underrepresented on the educational front, but not on the biological front, for sure.
For sure.
And, of course, TWiP at microbe.tv is where you would email to file a case report, guess, or just a question or comment.
Or for your own entertainment. Just
You could email us and say, hey,
yeah,
this is what I do, and I like what you do, or you don't, whatever you'd like.
I mean, the show notes are worth surveying.
TWiP at microbe.tv. The show notes are at microbe.tv/TWiP. Daniel Griffin can be found at Columbia University Irving Medical Center and parasiteswithoutborders.com. Thank you, Daniel.
Always a pleasure.
Dickson, Despommier, Racaniello.org, and thelivingriver.org. Gracias.
De nada.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. Thanks to Ronald Jenkins for his music and ASM for their support. You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon. Another TWiP
is parasitic.